Italy has just crossed a line that few countries ever want to cross. This is not a temporary dip. It is not a one-year anomaly. It is not something that will simply bounce back when the economy improves. What we are looking at now is a long structural decline in births that has been building for nearly 2 decades. And the numbers coming out of Italy suggest something much more serious than a bad year. They suggest a demographic shift that could reshape the country's economy, culture, workforce, and future prosperity for generations to come. When birth rates fall too far, too long, recovery becomes extremely difficult. And that is why many experts are now asking whether Italy has reached the demographic point of no return. The latest data shows just how deep this crisis has become. Wanted in Rome reported there were 369,944 babies born in Italy in 2024, a 2.6% decrease from the 379,890 births the previous year. The number of births in Italy in 2024 is the lowest since records began in 1861, after Italian unification, with the figure falling for the 16th year in a row. That single paragraph carries enormous weight. 16 consecutive years of decline is not random. It means every single year since 2008, Italy has welcomed fewer newborns than the year before. And now births have fallen to their lowest level since the country was unified more than 160 years ago. This is not simply a modern slowdown, it's historic. To understand the scale of this collapse, you have to go back to 2008. That was the last peak in Italy's birth numbers during the 2000s. Back then, there were 576,000 births. Today, the country is producing barely 2/3 of that figure. That means in just over 15 years, Italy has effectively lost more than 200,000 births annually. This is not a small shift. It's the equivalent of removing an entire large city worth of newborns from the population each year compared to where the country once stood. And when that trend compounds over time, the long-term consequences become enormous. Even more concerning is that this trend is not stabilising. It's accelerating. Wanted in Rome reported, preliminary data for the first 7 months of 2025 shows this negative trend continuing, with a 6.3% decline in newborns compared to the same period in 2024. That tells us something critical. The situation is not flattening out, it's getting worse. A 6.3% drop in just the first 7 months of the year signals that 2025 could end even lower than 2024. When decline becomes sharper rather than slower, it suggests that underlying pressures have not been resolved. If anything, they may be intensifying. At the centre of this issue is fertility. Birth totals matter, but fertility rates tell the deeper story. A country needs roughly 2.1 children per woman to maintain a stable population over time without relying heavily on immigration. Italy is nowhere near that threshold. Wanted in Rome reported, the fertility rate, the average number of children per woman of childbearing age, fell to a record low of 1.18 last year, down from 1.2 in 2023. Provisional figures for January to July 2025 suggest a further drop to 1.13. Those numbers are not just below replacement level, they are dramatically below it. A fertility rate of 1.13 means that each generation is effectively half replacing itself. When that continues across multiple generations, the population begins to contract rapidly. What makes this even more significant is that fertility has been falling steadily across generations. This is not about one specific age group delaying children, it's generational change. Wanted in Rome reported, the data paints a picture of a steady decline in fertility from 2.01 children per woman for the 1947 generation, the last to reach the so-called generational replacement threshold, to 1.44 for women born in 1975, who turned 49 in 2024. That sentence reveals the structural nature of the crisis. The 1947 generation was the last to hit replacement levels. Every generation since then has had fewer children than the one before, and the 1975 generation is finishing its childbearing years well below replacement. That means this decline has been embedded for decades. At the same time, childlessness is rising. Wanted in Rome reported, the decline in fertility per generation is accompanied by an increase in the number of women with no children. This figure stood at 10% for women born in 1947. However, in the 1975 cohort, women without children represent almost a quarter of the total, 23%. That is a dramatic social shift. Nearly 1 in 4 women in that cohort did not have any children at all. That changes family structures, it changes housing patterns, it changes consumption habits, and it changes the very shape of the future workforce. When more adults remain childless, population shrinkage accelerates. So what's driving this? The statistics agency, Istat, pointed to structural causes. Italy's potential parent pool has been shrinking for decades because fewer children were born in the 1970s and 1980s. Smaller generations grow up to become smaller parent groups. That creates a compounding effect. Even if fertility is stabilised tomorrow, there are simply fewer women of childbearing age than there were in previous decades. But that's only part of the picture. Economic insecurity plays a major role. Italy has struggled with slow growth, high youth unemployment, and widespread temporary contracts. When young adults cannot secure stable employment, long-term planning becomes difficult. Starting a family requires financial confidence. It requires housing security. It requires stable income. In an environment where temporary contracts dominate and wages remain relatively low, many couples delay having children or decide not to have them at all. Over time, delay turns into permanent decisions. Housing costs also matter. In many Italian cities, property prices and rental costs have risen while wages have stagnated. Multi-generational living remains common, not necessarily out of tradition, but out of economic necessity. When young adults remain financially dependent on parents well into their 30s, starting a family becomes even harder. The demographic crisis is therefore not isolated from economic policy. It's deeply connected to it. Immigration has provided some offset, but not enough to reverse the trend. Births involving at least one foreign parent make up roughly 21.8% of total births. That share has remained relatively stable. Romanian, Moroccan, and Albanian families represent some of the largest foreign origin birth groups. But even with this contribution, overall birth numbers continue to fall. Immigration can slow demographic decline, but it cannot fully compensate for sustained ultra-low fertility among the native population without significant reshaping. But even with this contribution, overall birth numbers continue to fall. Immigration can slow demographic decline, but it cannot fully compensate for sustained ultra-low fertility among the native population without significantly reshaping the demographic composition of the country. Meanwhile, Italy's population is aging rapidly. The average age has now risen to 46.8 years. Nearly a quarter of the population is over 65. That means fewer workers supporting more retirees. Pension systems become strained. Healthcare systems face rising demand. Tax bases shrink. When the working age population contracts, economic growth potential weakens. This creates a feedback loop. Slower growth makes it harder to support families. Harder conditions discourage births. Fewer births weaken future growth even further. The phrase point of no return is not used lightly. Demographers use it when fertility falls so low for so long that even strong pro-family policies struggle to reverse it. Countries like Japan and South Korea are facing similar challenges. Once social norms shift towards later marriage, fewer children, and higher childlessness, reversing course becomes extremely difficult. Financial incentives alone rarely restore fertility to replacement levels. Cultural expectations change. Lifestyle preferences evolve. Urbanisation increases. Individualism rises, and birth rates remain low. Italy now sits firmly in that territory. 16 consecutive years of decline, a fertility rate heading towards 1.1, a rapidly ageing population, smaller generations replacing larger ones. Even if the government introduced generous childcare subsidies, tax credits, and housing support tomorrow, the underlying age structure would still limit how quickly births could recover. There are simply fewer women in their 20s and 30s than there were 30 years ago. The long-term implications are profound. Schools may close as student numbers shrink. Rural areas could empty further as populations age. Economic dynamism could weaken as entrepreneurial energy declines. Political tensions may rise as younger workers feel burdened by supporting a growing elderly population. Public debt dynamics become harder to manage when growth slows and dependency ratios rise. But this is not just about economics. It's about national identity and social continuity. Italy is a country rich in history, culture, and tradition. Family has long been central to Italian life. Large gatherings, multi-generational households, strong kinship bonds. These have been defining features of society. Yet today, fewer children are being born into that cultural framework. Over time, that reshapes the social fabric itself. Some may argue that population decline is not necessarily catastrophic. Smaller populations can reduce environmental pressure and congestion, but rapid ageing combined with steep fertility decline creates imbalances that are difficult to manage. The issue is not simply fewer people, it's fewer young people relative to older generations. When the pyramid flips upside down, systems designed for growth struggle under contraction. Italy's demographic crisis did not begin overnight. It has been building quietly since 2008. But 2024 may be remembered as the year the numbers made it impossible to ignore. Record low births, record low fertility, accelerating decline into 2025, rising childlessness, rapid ageing. These are not isolated data points. They form a clear pattern. The question now is whether Italy can stabilise this trajectory or whether it has already crossed into irreversible contraction. Policy can help at the margins, but restoring fertility from 1.1 to 2.1 is one of the hardest challenges any developed nation can face. It requires economic reform, cultural renewal, housing stability, childcare infrastructure, and long-term confidence in the future. That is not a quick fix. That is generational work. Italy's story is also a warning to other European countries facing similar trends. Once decline becomes embedded, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. Demography moves slowly, but its consequences unfold relentlessly. And today, Italy stands at a critical threshold, confronting the possibility that its demographic future will look very different from its past. The numbers are clear, the trajectory is clear, and the stakes are enormous. Italy is not simply facing a low birth year. It's facing a demographic transformation that could define the next century. Whether this truly is the point of no return remains to be seen. But what is certain is that the window for action is narrowing and the clock is ticking.